245774 Barret versus United States. Mr. Larson.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. Possessing...
It was December 12th, 2011. In Mount Vernon, New York. A hard-edged city just north of the Bronx, where warehouses sit beside auto shops, where smoke rises from factory vents, and where cash moves quietly through back rooms and loading docks, long after banks have closed. It's just after noon. The cold weather was so harsh that people could see their breath. People rushed home, trying to escape the bitter cold. But parked along South 4th Avenue, sitting almost unnoticed beside the curb, was a silver Mercedes-Benz. Inside the car sat 3 men, closely watching and monitoring every movement in the area. They waited silently for the right moment to strike. The man behind the wheel was named Dwayne Barret. Dwayne Barret would later become one of the names connected to a case that reshaped federal criminal law across the United States, 14 years later. That afternoon, he sat inside the Mercedes, thinking about the money he expected to make. Inside a warehouse just down the street, money had recently changed hands. Barret waited patiently to get hold of it. Minutes earlier, people had arrived at the warehouse to buy untaxed cigarettes, and thousands of dollars had been made from the transaction. Cash. Easy to carry. Impossible to trace. Exactly the kind of score Barret and his crew had spent months searching for. The Mercedes gently pulled away from the curb, positioning itself 2 cars behind the minivan, so no one would suspect anything unusual. In early 2011, in the United States, there operated a group of men whose activities were so calculated that it took time before investigators could identify them. For months, these men moved almost invisibly through New York and Pennsylvania. They studied routines, watched businesses close, followed people carrying cash. They learned who looked vulnerable, who looked distracted, and who looked alone. Federal prosecutors never gave them a glamorous nickname. No mafia title. No street legend. No cartel mythology. In court records, they were referred to simply as the crew. And somehow, that made them feel even more dangerous. These were the men who terrorized parts of New York and Pennsylvania in 2011. Dwayne Barret was not the loudest member of the group. Not the most reckless either. He was the driver. The watcher. The steady one. Dwayne Barret was the man the crew depended on, because he stayed calm while everyone else lost control. Investigators later said Barret possessed a particular skill that made him valuable. Patience. The ability to sit inside a parked car for hours without drawing attention. To wait outside warehouses, gas stations, parking lots, mosques, watching people come and go until the perfect opportunity appeared. And when it did, he moved fast. If Barret was the wheel, Jermaine Dorr was the engine. According to prosecutors, he was the man who helped choose targets. Small business owners, cash-based merchants, immigrants, people carrying large amounts of money with little protection, victims who might hesitate before calling police. The kind of victims crews like this count on. Then there was Ty J. Todd. He was younger and less publicly known, but deeply tied to the incident that later drew national attention. Because on the day Gamar Dafala died, Todd was inside that Mercedes too. The crew's pattern. The first robbery happened in August 2011. 9 robberies in just 5 months. 9 moments where ordinary people suddenly found themselves staring into guns and knives. And with each robbery, the crew became more confident, more disciplined, more violent. On August 22, 2011, in Matamoras, Pennsylvania, a quiet town more than 90 miles from New York City, a gas station owner closed up shop for the day. He believed business had gone well. He carried roughly $45,000 in proceeds. He probably believed he was heading home. Instead, he was attacked. The money disappeared. And just like that, the crew's robbery spree had begun. By October 5th, the crew targeted telephone card distributors in the Bronx. They were robbed. Their money vanished. Then, on October 10th, a bodega employee was held at knife point and robbed of the day's proceeds. As the crew grew bolder, the violence escalated. Then came the robbery investigators would later describe as a turning point. This was no longer just theft. It became something more personal, something deeply disturbing. It was October 29, 2011. Ahmed Salahi left a Bronx mosque after Friday prayers. He believed he was simply heading home. But what he did not know was that he was being followed. Before he could react, the crew forced him into his own car at knife point. Then they drove him home. Inside the apartment were his brother Qasim and 2 children, 8 years old, 10 years old. According to federal records, the robbers ordered the family onto the floor at gunpoint. The children were told not to make a sound. Then the crew searched the apartment until they found cash hidden inside a closet. $15,000. They left with the money. But the fear inside that apartment stayed behind. By December 2011, the crew had changed. They were bolder now, more experienced, more dangerous. And on September 12th, everything crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. That afternoon, Gamar Dafala came to the warehouse to buy cigarettes. He completed the transaction and left with business partners Jamal Abdullah and Zhao Liang. What he did not know was that a Mercedes-Benz had been watching every movement around the warehouse. As the minivan moved through ordinary streets, the crew followed behind. Cars passed normally. People walked home. And inside the van, no one realized armed men had already chosen them as targets. Then, like a flash, they were ambushed. According to prosecutors, Jermaine Dorr and Tai J. Todd approached with guns drawn. Jamal Abdullah and Zhao Liang were forced out of the van. The vehicle was taken, and Gamar Dafala remained inside. Alive, terrified, trapped with armed men. As the robbery unfolded, Gamar Dafala secretly threw $10,000 out of the vehicle window. Maybe he hoped the money would satisfy them. Maybe he hoped losing the cash would save his life. Maybe he simply panicked. No one knows exactly why he did it. But according to prosecutors, the act enraged the crew. And moments later, Gamar Dafala was shot. Gamar Dafala died on December 12, 2011. And even after the shooting, the crew kept moving. According to investigators, they allegedly moved on toward another robbery, as though nothing had happened. No panic. No frantic escape. No visible collapse under the weight of taking a life. To detectives, that became one of the most chilling parts of the case. The murder was not treated like a catastrophe. It was treated like another step in an operation already in motion. Then came the cleanup. According to federal prosecutors, the men disposed of the weapon and carefully erased traces of themselves from the scene. Latex gloves, cleaning solution, vehicle surfaces wiped down piece by piece, evidence removed, fingerprints avoided. It did not look like the behavior of men acting blindly in shock. It looked procedural, practiced, almost routine.
Violence has a way of changing investigations. A robbery can sit buried in paperwork for weeks, sometimes months. But once murder becomes involved, everything changes. Investigators move faster. Agencies begin sharing intelligence. Old case files get reopened. And by the opening months of 2012, investigators across New York and Pennsylvania began noticing something they could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The robberies carried the same fingerprints. Not literal fingerprints, behavioral ones. Victims were selected in eerily similar ways. Cash-based workers, small business operators, men transporting large amount of money with little protection. The attacks followed the same rhythm. Surveillance first, then pursuit, then sudden violence. Even the geography formed a pattern, stretching across boroughs and state lines like pieces of a puzzle, slowly locking together. Soon the investigation expanded beyond a single police unit. Federal agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives joined forces with the New York City Police Department and federal prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. At the time, the office was led by Preet Bharara, a prosecutor nationally known for pursuing organized crime, corruption, and high-profile federal cases. And piece by piece, the walls began closing in. Some survivors identified faces. Phone records placed suspects near robbery scenes at critical moments. Witness statements, gathered separately, began matching each other in disturbing detail. Investigators mapped movements, timelines, vehicles, communications, until isolated incidents no longer looked isolated at all. What once appeared to be scattered street crimes was beginning to resemble a coordinated criminal operation. Then came the realization investigators had been moving toward for months. They were no longer searching for a theory. They believed they had found the crew. The trial unfolded inside a federal courtroom in Manhattan, less than 20 miles from many of the streets where the robberies had taken place. For 2 weeks, prosecutors reconstructed the crew's movements almost hour by hour. Jurors listened as witnesses described armed ambushes, stolen cash, terrified families forced onto apartment floors, and the final moments of Gamar Dafala's life. Surveillance evidence appeared on courtroom screens. Phone records traced movements across boroughs and state lines. Prosecutors walked the jury through the cleanup after the murder. The latex gloves, the wiped-down vehicles, the discarded weapon. They argued none of it looked accidental or impulsive. It looked organized. By the time closing arguments arrived, the government's narrative was clear. This was not a loose collection of street robberies. It was a coordinated criminal operation, one that had escalated steadily toward deadly violence. Then the courtroom fell silent, as jurors disappeared behind closed doors to deliberate. When they returned, the outcome came quickly. Guilty on every count. The verdict brought visible relief to investigators and prosecutors who had spent months piecing the case together. But for the defendants seated at the defense table, the most devastating moment was still ahead. Then came the sentence. 90 years in federal prison. For Dwayne Barret, it was effectively a sentence to die behind bars. Yet buried deep inside that punishment was a legal issue so technical that almost nobody outside the courtroom noticed it at the time. An issue that years later would travel all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States and reshape federal sentencing law across the country. Federal prosecutors had charged Barret under multiple overlapping firearm statutes tied to the same criminal episode. A strategy defense attorneys often call charge stacking. The concept is simple, but its consequences can be enormous. Prosecutors layer firearm counts on top of one another, allowing mandatory penalties to accumulate like bricks in a wall. Each additional conviction increases sentencing exposure. Each added count raises pressure on defendants to plead guilty or cooperate. On paper, the sentence breakdown looked almost mechanical. Hobbs Act conspiracy, firearm enhancement, firearm causing death, consecutive sentencing requirements. One count stacking onto another. But Barrett's lawyers focused on something they believed crossed a constitutional line. Two separate firearm convictions appeared to punish the exact same act. The same shooting, the same victim, the same robbery. And under long-standing Supreme Court doctrine that raised a dangerous legal question. Could the government punish one act twice, simply by charging it under two different statutes? At the time, the argument seemed unlikely to change anything. Barret was already heading to prison for 90 years. Do you think Barret would truly spend 90 years behind bars? While Barret sat inside federal prison, far from the cameras and headlines that once surrounded the trial, the legal foundation supporting parts of his sentence began to crack. Across the country, the Supreme Court of the United States was reconsidering how federal firearm statutes had been interpreted for years. One by one, major decisions began narrowing the government's ability to impose certain mandatory sentencing enhancements.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the
In 2019 came United States versus Davis, a ruling that struck down part of a federal criminal statute as unconstitutionally vague. Then 4 years later came Laura versus United States, another decision limiting how firearm sentencing provisions could be stacked together. To most Americans, the rulings barely registered outside legal circles. But inside federal prisons, inmates and defense lawyers were reading every word. Because every new decision weakened another piece of the sentencing structure prosecutors had used in the Barret case. And eventually, Barrett's attorneys saw an opening. What if two of his convictions should never have existed simultaneously? What if the law itself had been applied incorrectly? The question moved upward through the federal appeals system until years after the robberies and years after the murder of Gamar Tafala, the case arrived at the highest court in America. By the time the case reached Washington, it no longer centered only on Dwayne Barret. The issue before the court had become much larger than a single defendant or a single robbery crew. The legal question sounded technical, almost clinical when read aloud inside a marble courtroom. Could the federal government convict a defendant under both Section 924A and Section 924 for the exact same criminal act? Or did doing so amount to impermissible double punishment? To ordinary people, it sounded like statutory interpretation. But to defense lawyers, prosecutors, and judges across the country, The consequences were enormous. Thousands of federal sentences had been built using similar charging structures. If the court ruled Barrett's sentence unlawful, the decision could ripple through the entire federal system. Then came the twist almost nobody expected. The United States government agreed with Barrett. Federal prosecutors themselves acknowledged that both convictions should not stand together. It was an extraordinary moment. The government effectively conceded that part of its own conviction structure had gone too far. But the court still wanted the issue fully argued, so the justices appointed outside counsel to defend the opposing position, ensuring the constitutional question would be tested from both sides. Inside the courtroom, lawyers debated statutory text, congressional intent, and decades of criminal precedent beneath the towering marble columns of the nation's highest court. And then, on January 14, 2026, the decision arrived. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote the majority opinion. The court held that the same criminal act could not support convictions under both statutes simultaneously. One act, one punishment structure, not two. The ruling immediately became binding precedent across every federal court in the country. Dwayne Barrett remains convicted of serious violent crimes. Nothing in the Supreme Court's ruling erased the robberies. Nothing changed the death of Gamar Dafala. And Gamar Dafala remained what he was before the appeals, before the legal arguments, before the constitutional debates, a human being whose life ended on a winter afternoon in Mount Vernon. But the case changed federal criminal law nationwide. Inside prisons across America, defense attorneys and inmates began reopening old files. Sentences once considered settled were suddenly questioned again. Lawyers re-examined firearm enhancements, consecutive penalties, and overlapping convictions, searching for cases constructed the same way Barrett's had been constructed years earlier. What began as a violent robbery investigation in New York had evolved into a Supreme Court precedent capable of reshaping thousands of federal sentencing decisions. And in the end, the case left behind two very different legacies, one written in blood, the other written into American law. The legal question remains: is protection against double punishment merely statutory or constitutional? The story of the crew carries moral lessons that go far beyond crime and punishment. At its core, it is a story about how small decisions, unchecked violence, and systemic power can spiral into consequences that affect victims, families, investigators, courts, and even national law. One lesson stands out clearly. Violence escalates faster than people expect. The crew did not begin with murder. According to the case narrative, their crimes escalated over time. Surveillance, robberies, intimidation, home invasions, then eventually homicide. The story reflects a harsh reality often seen in criminal enterprises. Once violence becomes normalized, the threshold for taking a life becomes lower. Another lesson is this: easy money often carries hidden destruction. Many of the robberies centered around quick payouts and cash businesses. But the long-term consequences were catastrophic. A man lost his life. Families were traumatized. Multiple people received decades in federal prison. Entire lives became permanently defined by one criminal enterprise. The story also reveals how organized crime often depends on studying human weakness. The crew allegedly became methodical, studying routines, identifying vulnerable victims, targeting people less likely to seek immediate police help. It highlights the importance of awareness, community protection, and systems that make victims feel safe reporting crimes quickly. And perhaps the final lesson is this: crime rarely stays contained. One robbery became 9. One violent operation expanded across jurisdictions. And what began as local street crime eventually reached the Supreme Court of the United States. Actions rarely affect only the people directly involved. Sometimes, their consequences reshape the law itself.